Hi, and welcome to part 2 of our introduction to the Tragedy of Coriolanus by William Shakespeare. In this half, we will look at the play itself and the plot within it and the themes within it and see how they tie back into the background that we covered in part 1. Act 1 opens in the midst of a grain shortage. It calls into sharp contrast the wealth gap and privileges of the patricians versus the plebeians, the aristocrats versus the commoners. The commoners are starving and think the government is hoarding grain. And they're also angry because even with the appointment of the tribunes, they have very little power and representation in this new republic. And this is where our play begins, and it's obviously a recurring theme throughout world history. Into the middle of this uprising walks in Senator Menenius, who is well-liked, he's popular, he temporarily placates the population with a parable about the belly and the body politic, which sounds an awful lot like Reaganomics and trickle-down theory. And then Caius Marcius arrives, right after he gets them all calmed down. He riles them back up and then tells Menenius that there are 5 tribunes that have been elected to serve to represent the plebeians. 2 of those are Sicinius and Brutus, who in his mind are just big trash talkers. They're leading uneducated, cowardly deplorables. So then most of the rest of Act 1 consists of Caius Marcius going off to war because the Volsci are about to attack Rome. He captures their city of Coriolanus. He gets the name Coriolanus as a reward for the capture of the city, and then he spends most of the rest of that act, trying to track down his archenemy Aufidius, who gets away. In Act 1, we also get our first glimpse of the 3 women in the play: Volumnia, who is Coriolanus' mother, Virgilia, who is his wife, and Valeria, who is his wife's best friend. The names Shakespeare chooses for these women are quite revealing. Historically, the wife was named Volumnia, and the mother was known as Virtulia. But in this play, the mother is known as Volumnia, probably to emphasize the volume and power of the mother figure, while simultaneously he contrasts it by naming the wife Virgilia to emphasize the more traditionally desirable qualities of a virgin. It's a similar cognate with Virginia in modern English. And Valeria's name is a pure symbol of patriarchy, as her brother is Valerius, and this is just a feminine derivation of that. When honor is conveyed only through military exploits, as in ancient Rome, there is no way for a woman to gain honor or recognition or even a sense of self-worth other than through her husband or son. And we see this in the disturbing amount of delight that Volumnia, the mother, takes in her son's wounds, because she could A, lovingly tend the wound, and B, she can use him to boast of her son's masculinity. And both her and Valeria, the friend, take an inordinate amount of delight in Coriolanus' son's mutilation of small butterflies. Virgilia, the wife, on the other hand, is the only character in the play who actually weeps at the thought that her husband might perish of his wounds, and she weeps again when he comes home from war because she's glad that he's alive. In Act 2, therefore, when Coriolanus is nominated for a consul, Volumnia could not have been happier. If women had been allowed in the military, no doubt Volumnia would have clawed her way up to the status of a general, dragging her son behind her the whole time. Even the 2 tribunes later on in the play sense her power when they try to avoid Volumnia at the Senate Hall. And when they insult her for trying to act like a man, her comeback is, "Note but this, fool, was not a man my father?" The position of consul is the highest rank one could get in the ancient Roman Republic, similar to a president or a prime minister. But Coriolanus doesn't want it. He's a career soldier, not a politician, but Mommy Dearest thinks he should go for it, so reluctantly he does. The nomination of consul requires Coriolanus to get the approval of both the Senate and of the plebeians, and he is supposed to greet them in near nakedness, wearing rags, what they call humble weeds, all the better to show off his wounds and to boast about his battles, which are all these cities marked here in red, and then therefore get their votes. Given that the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, was named and deposed for his arrogance and abuse of power, this act of submission to the people is far more than just a symbolic gesture. It's an outward physical manifestation that whoever is elected to consulship will not crave power for power's sake. The citizens and the minor officials are initially not sure how they feel about Coriolanus as consul. Some hate him for his attitude toward plebeians, and others are concerned that if they do not ratify him after his crushing victory at Corioli, the plebeians will seem to be an ungrateful and monstrous multitude. Coriolanus, however, really doesn't care what they think. He despises them all. He thinks that by capitulating to the demands of the plebeians and to allow their votes, which he repeatedly calls voices, if he allows them to influence in politics, it'll weaken the Senate, it will promote further sedition, it'll be the downfall of Rome's glory and nobility. He thinks that being true to his own beliefs is a sign of his own nobility. But even his mother argues that, you know what, get the people's vote first, idiot, then be noble. If in war it can be honorable to pretend to be braver or bolder than you are in order to win, how can it be less honorable or strategically less sound to pretend humility in times of peace to win a consulship? So in these two acts, 1, 2, and 3, Shakespeare addresses the difference between honor from honesty and honor from humility, and suggests that true nobility comes from humbleness. So Coriolanus accepts this task only grudgingly. He really does not understand true humility, and he greets the plebeians with the barest amount of humility possible, and he mocks them, and he's cold to them, and they initially vote for him anyway because, hey, he's a celebrity. But despite everyone's warnings, Coriolanus' temper and his anger are triggered, and they get the better of him, and the people, with careful prompting from the tribunes, Sicinius and Brutus, they withdraw their support. And while they rightfully fear that Coriolanus might, if elected, make life worse for the plebeians, the tribunes are also just as equally concerned with protecting their newfound power, as the office of tribune was only recently created to give them some representation in government. In any case, they call for Coriolanus to be thrown off a cliff, and the Senate chooses to banish him instead. Here's a picture of that cliff. It's the Tarpeian Rock on Palatine Hill in Rome, which is where the Senate House is located. So in Act 4, Coriolanus then travels to Antium, the capital city of the Volscians, to team up with his former enemies, especially his archenemy Tullus Aufidius, to get revenge on Rome. He presents his throat to Aufidius' knife with the plea of, "Kill me," or "use me," and a delighted Aufidius gets even more excited than he was on his wedding night about the opportunity to thrust his sword alongside Coriolanus. Despite the fact that this Roman warrior had just captured Corioli and killed lots of Volscians, most everyone from servants to soldiers to senators are wowed by his fame. They put him in command of troops, and Coriolanus marches with his new army toward Rome, historically in 488 BC. When Aufidius' lieutenant questions Aufidius' actions and that of the rest of the soldiers who are fawning over Coriolanus, we get a sense that even if Coriolanus can beat Aufidius physically in battle, not all battles will be won on the field, and Aufidius is at heart more clever and devious than his military counterpart. In Act 5, the frightened Romans send emissary after emissary to try and dissuade Coriolanus' attack on Rome, but he refuses to relent, until he's approached by his domineering mother, who persuades him that he's being a very bad boy. And does he really want Mommy to die? His newfound allies, enraged that Coriolanus agreed to a peace treaty instead of attacking Rome, reward him by murdering him and then giving him a state funeral worthy of a respected warrior. Overall, the play is loosely based on historical events, but Shakespeare does take some liberties with the timeline. It's also a pretty straightforward plot, especially compared to, say, the likes of Cymbeline or some of his cross-dressing comedies, but like many of Shakespeare's darker plays, the underlying themes are deep. Thus, when we look at the story in context, we can see that it's much greater than a story about a simple soldier. For example, in Act 2, in the humble weed scene, where he's begging for votes, that's really a metaphor for the class war between the patricians and the plebeians, something we still struggle with today in terms of getting money out of politics. And since honor and military service are inevitably linked to class, the theme of masculinity also rears its head throughout the play, perhaps most profoundly when Coriolanus heads to Antium and the home of his arch-enemy Aufidius, and you could cut the sexual tension in that room with a knife. Coriolanus is not a very sympathetic protagonist, and I may dare say that he's a person only his mother could love, but he's also very much the product of his culture. We see toxic masculinity raise its head fiercely even today, supported not just by men, but also perpetuated and manipulated by the women and the children that are raised in a patriarchal culture. Volumnia's kneeling scene in Act 5 can be played a number of different ways, but each and every one of them reinforce the idea that she is well aware that she is playing a role within a particular structure, and she does so shamelessly, or perhaps shamefully, for we see that shame is also insidious. It can make us question our sense of belonging, our worthiness, our flaws, but it's also neither helpful nor productive, especially when weaponized, and much more likely to result in destruction and hurtful behavior other than offering any sort of solution or cure. So while Volumnia is praised as a heroine for saving Rome and as a strong woman, she also in the end destroyed her only son, even though it was not her hand that wielded the sword in the end. I could go on, but I'll leave you with a couple of last thoughts. This play is not one of Shakespeare's more popular ones, because it raises uncomfortable questions that are still sharply relevant for today's modern world. So as you read through it or you watch it, watch for the harsh, guttural, rough, angry words. Look for the visceral images, especially that of animals. Shakespeare uses a lot of animal metaphors in his play. And watch also for the vertical imagery, rising, falling, leveling, and think about the role of a soldier in today's world and what happens when they cannot find a place to fit in, just like Coriolanus. And what we must do as a society to remove the word toxic from the concept of masculinity and femininity. In any case, I hope I've made you think a little bit about what role you want to play in our own republic as it undergoes changes and hopes and fears and tragedies and possibly a revolution of its own. Thank you and good night.